Most people think the biggest mistake an HOA president can make is writing the wrong violation notice. They're wrong. The biggest mistake is walking onto the wrong piece of land and assuming the law belongs to you. The first thing I noticed that morning wasn't the sound of tires rolling over my gravel driveway. It was the sharp metallic click of my front pasture gate swinging open without permission. I looked up from the feed bucket in my hands as the smell of fresh-cut hay mixed with damp earth after an overnight shower. My horses barely lifted their heads. They were used to visitors. I wasn't. A white Lexus SUV eased past the entrance, crunching slowly across the limestone gravel like it had every right to be there. The morning sun reflected off its polished hood while dust drifted lazily through the cool Texas air. The woman behind the wheel stepped out before the engine even finished idling. Perfect blonde hair, designer sunglasses, crisp white blouse that somehow looked untouched by the wind. She carried a leather clipboard tucked confidently under one arm, as if it were a badge of authority. Victoria Holloway, president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association. Behind her came two board members wearing matching polo shirts embroidered with the HOA logo, followed by a young maintenance contractor holding a camera and measuring tape. None of them knocked. None of them called ahead. They simply marched through my open pasture as though my farm had become another item on their weekly checklist. Routine property compliance inspection, Victoria announced loudly. Not to me, but almost to the air itself, like she expected everyone within earshot to recognize her voice. Will only be a few minutes if your property meets community standards. I rested the feed bucket on the fence and watched her approach. My boots were still damp from crossing the pasture before sunrise. The sleeves of my old work shirt were rolled to my elbows, stained with grease from repairing my tractor the night before. To anyone driving past, I probably looked exactly like what I wanted them to see. Just another farmer trying to keep his land running one day at a time. Victoria glanced over me once before dismissing me completely. I recognized that look. It was the same expression people gave when they believed they had already figured out your entire life in 3 seconds. We'll need access to every structure, she continued while flipping through several printed forms. Barns, storage buildings, equipment sheds, fencing, water systems, livestock areas, and any additional improvements that may affect neighboring property values. She didn't ask. She instructed. One of the board members immediately began photographing my fencing. The contractor wandered toward my equipment barn without waiting for permission. Another member scribbled notes while pointing toward a row of utility trailers parked beside the workshop. I never raised my voice. I never stepped in their way. I simply stood there listening to boots scrape across weathered wood and hearing camera shutters echo through the quiet morning. Somewhere beyond the tree line, a mockingbird broke into song while the breeze carried the scent of cedar and fresh soil across the pasture. Victoria believed she was conducting another ordinary HOA inspection. What she didn't realize was that every step she took, every photograph she ordered, and every locked gate she chose to open was being recorded as part of an investigation that had absolutely nothing to do with neighborhood rules. And by the time she finally looked at me closely enough to ask who I really was, the answer she wanted would already be far too late. People usually assume a farm tells you everything about the person who owns it. They see weathered fences, muddy boots, and an old pickup truck. Then they build an entire story in their heads. They never imagine the man repairing a water line before breakfast might spend the following week sitting across from federal prosecutors reviewing corruption files. That misunderstanding had become my greatest advantage. My name is Malcolm Hayes, and my family has worked this land for nearly 70 years. My grandfather bought the original 80 acres after returning home from the Korean War with little more than determination and a second-hand tractor. My father expanded the property, one pasture at a time, believing that every honest acre earned was worth more than any flashy investment in the city. By the time the farm reached me, it was more than a business. Every fence post carried fingerprints from someone in my family. Every oak tree marked another memory. Even the old red barn still smelled like cedar boards, machine oil, and the leather gloves my father refused to throw away. I never wanted attention. The farm gave me exactly what I needed. Quiet mornings, honest work, predictable routines. Before sunrise, I fed the horses, checked the cattle, inspected the irrigation pumps, and walked the fence lines with a mug of black coffee warming my hands against the cool morning air. The gravel always sounded different depending on the season. In summer, it cracked beneath dry boots. After rain, it settled into a softer crunch that echoed across the pasture. Those small details kept me grounded after spending too many years chasing people who believed expensive suits and official titles placed them above the law. Most of my neighbors believed I worked as an agricultural consultant for the federal government. That explanation was close enough to satisfy polite conversation without inviting more questions. I preferred it that way. Real investigations depend on patience, not publicity. The fewer people who knew what I actually did for a living, the easier it was to separate my work from my home. My badge stayed locked inside a steel safe hidden behind ordinary shelves filled with ranch records, veterinary receipts, and equipment manuals. It was never something I carried around to impress anyone. A badge is not supposed to start conversations. It is supposed to finish them when the facts are finally complete. As Victoria and her board members wandered farther across my property, I watched them with the same calm attention that had served me throughout my career. Every unnecessary order she gave revealed another assumption. Every confident statement showed how completely she believed nobody would ever challenge her authority. She pointed toward my equipment shed while complaining about visual standards, never noticing the small weatherproof security camera mounted beneath the roofline. She criticized the condition of an old livestock trailer without realizing the entire area had been under continuous recording for months. Even the contractor following her looked uncomfortable as he photographed machinery that had absolutely nothing to do with neighborhood regulations. The breeze carried the scent of fresh alfalfa through the open barn doors while wind stirred an American flag hanging beside my workshop. I stood quietly beside the fence, saying almost nothing, because experience had taught me that people reveal far more when they believe nobody is paying close attention. Victoria thought she had arrived to evaluate my property. She did not yet understand that I had been evaluating her decisions from the moment her tires crossed my gate. Victoria Holloway had mastered a very specific kind of confidence, the kind that grows when nobody has ever told you no for a very long time. She had been president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association for almost 6 years, and somewhere along the way she stopped believing she represented the neighborhood and started believing she owned it. Around town, she drove a spotless white Lexus that always seemed freshly polished, even after a thunderstorm. Her expensive perfume usually reached a room before she did. Mixing strangely with the smell of printer ink from the stack of violation notices she carried almost everywhere. She spoke with a practiced smile that never quite reached her eyes, delivering every sentence as though it were already backed by a judge's signature. The residents inside the subdivision rarely argued with her anymore. It was simply easier to repaint a mailbox, replace a fence, or pay another fine than spend weeks fighting someone who acted as though every conversation ended with her winning. I had heard the stories for months. A retired schoolteacher received 3 separate warnings because her flower beds supposedly extended 6 inches beyond approved landscaping guidelines. A young couple was ordered to remove a wooden swing their children had used for years because it did not match the approved neighborhood color palette. One family spent nearly $2,000 replacing perfectly good exterior lights after Victoria declared they looked outdated. Every story followed the same pattern. She arrived with her clipboard, quoted regulations nobody had ever actually read, and left people feeling as though they had somehow broken laws instead of neighborhood preferences. The strange part was that my farm had never belonged to her association. My property sat just outside the official subdivision boundary, protected by recorded county maps that had not changed in decades. The previous owners of Willow Creek Estates had tried more than once to purchase a portion of my pasture so they could build another entrance road, but my father politely declined every offer before he passed away. Since then, the answer had remained exactly the same. No amount of pressure could change a property line recorded at the county courthouse. Apparently, Victoria saw that history differently. To her, the farm was an unfinished project waiting for someone with enough determination to bring it under neighborhood control. I noticed the way she studied my fields instead of simply inspecting them. Her eyes lingered on the rolling pasture beyond the barns, the fishing pond reflecting the morning sun, and the long stretch of open land that separated the subdivision from the highway. She was not looking at livestock. She was imagining possibilities. New entrances, walking trails, higher property values. She viewed every acre through the lens of expansion rather than ownership. While one board member measured the distance between fence posts, Victoria pointed toward my equipment shed and quietly told another volunteer to photograph every structure from multiple angles. The contractor hesitated for a moment before following her instructions, glancing toward me as if hoping I might object. I did not. Silence has a remarkable way of encouraging people to keep making decisions they will later wish they had never made. Victoria interpreted my patience as surrender. Her smile grew wider with every passing minute, and the authority in her voice became even sharper. Standing there beneath the wide Texas sky, with the smell of fresh hay drifting through the breeze and cattle grazing peacefully beyond the fence, I realized she had convinced herself that this morning would become another easy victory. She had absolutely no idea she was walking deeper into a situation she did not understand, and the confidence she wore so proudly was about to become the very evidence that would unravel everything she believed she controlled. Victoria's inspection became more ambitious with every minute that passed. She stopped pretending she was simply checking compliance and started behaving as though she had complete authority over everything inside my property lines. She pointed toward my main equipment barn and motioned for the contractor to open the sliding door. When he hesitated, she frowned, reached for the handle herself, and pulled it wide enough for sunlight to spill across the concrete floor. The familiar scent of diesel fuel, cedar lumber, and clean machine oil drifted into the cool morning air. She stepped inside without so much as asking permission. One board member immediately began taking photographs, while another wrote notes on a printed inspection form. "Document everything," Victoria said calmly. "We may need additional enforcement measures." I leaned against the fence rail and watched the entire scene unfold. My pulse never changed. Years of interviewing confident people had taught me that the loudest voice in the room often carried the weakest understanding of the law. Victoria walked past my tractor, paused beside a row of neatly organized tool cabinets, and pointed towards several locked storage lockers along the back wall. "What is inside those?" she asked. I simply answered, "Personal equipment." Her smile tightened. "The association has the right to verify anything that may affect community safety." She nodded toward the contractor again. "Please photograph the locks." The camera shutter echoed through the barn several times before they moved outside. They crossed the yard toward my livestock pens, opening gates as they went. A pair of horses looked up briefly before returning to their hay, completely unimpressed by the unexpected visitors. The breeze carried the sweet smell of fresh alfalfa while an old windmill turned slowly against the bright blue Texas sky. Victoria continued writing as if she were building a legal case with every sentence. She circled my irrigation pond, measured the distance between a fence and the access road, and even instructed one board member to photograph the county survey marker near the eastern pasture. That caught my attention more than anything else. Most people walked past that marker without noticing it. Victoria studied it for several seconds before quietly telling another volunteer, "We should compare this with our development map." Her words confirmed something I had suspected for quite a while. This visit had never been about overgrown grass, fence paint, or livestock. She was looking for a way to justify expanding the association beyond its actual boundaries. As they continued wandering across the property, she dictated possible violations that did not exist, questioned the placement of utility buildings that had been standing for decades, and spoke confidently about restrictions that had absolutely no connection to my land. Every assumption sounded more certain than the last. Every instruction encouraged someone else to step a little farther beyond the limits of their authority. One board member even apologized quietly after accidentally walking through a flower bed near my porch, but Victoria dismissed the concern with a wave of her hand. "It is part of the inspection," she said. "We have to be thorough." I looked toward the small weather station mounted beside my barn, listening to the faint electronic hum that blended almost perfectly with the wind moving through the pasture grass. The cameras remained silent. The microphones continued recording. Every conversation, every photograph, every decision, and every unnecessary step was being preserved exactly as it happened. Victoria believed she was creating evidence against me. She never considered the possibility that she was carefully assembling a record of her own choices, one confident decision at a time. By then I understood exactly what Victoria was doing, but more importantly, I understood what she believed. She believed silence meant surrender. She believed patience meant weakness. She believed that because I had not interrupted her inspection, I had accepted her authority. That assumption was becoming more valuable with every passing minute. I picked up the feed bucket again and continued scattering hay along the fence while keeping her in the corner of my eye. The horses followed me without concern, their steady footsteps blending with the rustle of dry grass moving across the pasture. Somewhere above us a hawk circled lazily in the clear blue sky, and the only other sound came from the steady clicking of camera shutters as the board members documented things they had absolutely no legal authority to inspect. Victoria eventually stopped near my workshop and unfolded a printed packet from her clipboard. She reviewed several pages before placing a bright orange notice against the side of the building as though she had already reached her conclusion. Multiple compliance concerns, she announced confidently. Failure to cooperate may result in additional administrative action. Her words sounded rehearsed, almost automatic, like she had delivered the same speech dozens of times before. One of the board members asked whether they should verify property ownership records before continuing. Victoria barely looked up from her paperwork. "The association has everything we need," she replied. "Proceed with the photographs." That answer told me far more than she realized. Confident investigators verify facts before reaching conclusions. Confident bureaucrats often do the opposite. The contractor walked toward another storage building and paused beside a weatherproof utility box mounted to the exterior wall. He glanced back at Victoria, waiting for instructions. "Get every angle," she said. "We may need these later." He nodded and raised the camera again. None of them noticed the small indicator light tucked beneath the roof overhang. It flashed once every few seconds, quietly confirming that every movement across the yard had been preserved from multiple viewpoints. Months earlier, I had upgraded the security system after several incidents involving trespassers cutting across neighboring farmland. High-resolution cameras covered every entrance, every equipment building, every livestock enclosure, and each access road leading onto the property. The recordings were stored automatically with synchronized timestamps, location data, and audio. I had installed the system for practical reasons, never expecting it to become this useful. Victoria continued walking as though she owned the place, occasionally pointing toward structures and assigning someone else another task. Every instruction encouraged another person to cross another boundary. Every unnecessary decision expanded the record already being created. I never had to persuade anyone to make a mistake. I only had to give them enough time to make their own choices. That principle had guided countless investigations throughout my career, and human nature rarely disappointed. People who truly respected legal limits usually stopped to ask permission. People who believed rules only applied to everyone else simply kept moving forward. Standing there beside my weathered fence with the smell of fresh cedar drifting from the open barn and warm sunlight spreading across the pasture, I realized the morning had reached the point where nothing else needed to happen. The evidence was complete long before anyone understood they were creating it, and Victoria still believed she was collecting proof against an ordinary farmer when, in reality, every confident step she had taken had quietly strengthened an entirely different case. Victoria finally turned toward me with the satisfied expression of someone who believed the morning had gone exactly as planned. She tucked her clipboard beneath one arm and walked across the gravel until only a few feet separated us. The breeze lifted the edge of one of her inspection forms while the smell of warm cedar drifted from the open barn behind her. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "based on everything we have documented today, you will be receiving several formal notices from the association. If these issues are not corrected within the required time frame, additional enforcement options will be considered." I looked at the stack of papers in her hands before meeting her eyes again. "Are you finished?" I asked quietly. She seemed almost surprised that I had finally spoken more than a sentence. "For today," she replied confidently, "unless you would like to make this process more difficult." One of the board members smiled as though the conversation had already ended. Another continued taking photographs of my workshop from across the yard. The contractor lowered his camera and shifted awkwardly, looking less certain than everyone else. I nodded once, reached into the pocket of my work jacket, and removed a small leather credential wallet that had remained there all morning. I opened it carefully and held it where Victoria could see the gold badge beside the identification card. The sunlight reflected briefly across the metal before settling into silence again. "My name is Malcolm Hayes," I said evenly. "Special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Nobody spoke for several seconds. The contractor slowly lowered his camera completely. One of the board members frowned and looked toward Victoria, waiting for her reaction. She stared at the badge, then laughed softly, shaking her head with complete confidence. "That is supposed to impress me?" she asked. "Anyone can buy something that looks official online." I closed the credential wallet without the slightest change in expression and slipped it back into my pocket. "You are free to believe whatever you like," I answered. "Facts do not depend on opinions." She crossed her arms. "If this is your attempt to intimidate the association, it will not work. We have legal authority." I simply nodded again. "I understand that is what you believe." Her confidence returned almost instantly. She turned back toward the others and instructed them to gather the remaining paperwork. While they organized photographs and inspection forms, I removed my cellular phone from my jacket and unlocked it. I did not make a dramatic announcement. I did not threaten anyone. I selected a single contact, pressed the call button, and waited. The line connected almost immediately. "This is Hayes," I said calmly. "The activity we discussed has concluded. The documentation is complete. You can proceed according to the existing schedule." I listened for only a few seconds before replying, "Understood. I will remain on site." Then I ended the call and slipped the phone back into my pocket. Victoria watched the entire exchange with a look that mixed curiosity and amusement. "Calling your lawyer?" she asked with a confident smile. I looked across the pasture where the afternoon breeze rippled through the tall grass beneath the wide Texas sky. "No," I answered. "I called the people who have been waiting very patiently for this morning to unfold exactly the way it just did." For the first time since she had driven through my gate, the certainty in Victoria's expression faded just enough for doubt to quietly take its place. For several long seconds, nobody moved. The only sounds were the wind pushing through the pasture grass, the distant splash of water against the edge of my irrigation pond, and the slow creak of the old windmill turning above the barn. Victoria tried to recover her confident smile, but it no longer looked effortless. She glanced toward the two board members as if expecting one of them to laugh with her. Neither of them did. The contractor quietly lowered his camera bag to the ground and took a small step backward without anyone telling him to. "We are leaving," Victoria said finally, forcing authority back into her voice. "This inspection is complete." She reached for the orange notice she had attached to my workshop, straightened the papers on her clipboard, and motioned for everyone to head toward the front gate. I did not stop them. I simply watched as they gathered their measuring tape, cameras, and folders with noticeably less confidence than they had carried only minutes earlier. Before they reached their vehicles, a faint rumble rolled across the quiet countryside. At first it blended naturally with the distant sounds of highway traffic several miles away. Then another engine joined it, and another. Within moments, several dark sport utility vehicles appeared at the end of the county road, traveling at ordinary speed without flashing lights or dramatic urgency. They turned through my front entrance one after another with calm precision before stopping along the gravel drive. A separate county vehicle followed behind them and parked near the fence. Nobody rushed. Nobody shouted. Doors opened almost simultaneously, and several professionally dressed investigators stepped out carrying folders instead of displaying force. The atmosphere changed instantly. One of the board members whispered something I could not hear. The contractor stared quietly at the line of arriving vehicles before looking back toward Victoria, whose expression had shifted from irritation to unmistakable confusion. A senior investigator walked toward me first, offering a brief nod before speaking in a calm voice. "Good afternoon, Agent Hayes. We appreciate your patience." I returned the greeting just as casually. "Everything was documented according to plan," I replied. He accepted a small, encrypted storage device from my hand containing the synchronized recordings from the farm security system, then thanked me before turning toward the rest of the group. Victoria stepped forward immediately. "Excuse me," she said, attempting to regain control of the conversation. "What exactly is happening here?" The investigator answered politely. "Ma'am, we are here regarding an ongoing federal public corruption investigation. We ask that everyone remain available while we verify several matters connected to today's activities." The words seemed to drain the remaining confidence from the group. Nobody interrupted him. Nobody argued. One board member quietly lowered her clipboard and looked at the ground. Another slowly removed his identification badge from around his neck, as though suddenly unsure whether he wanted to be associated with the inspection at all. Victoria looked back at me with genuine disbelief, searching my face for some sign that this had all been a bluff. She found none. I had never raised my voice, never threatened anyone, and never tried to win an argument. I had simply allowed every decision to unfold naturally until the facts could speak for themselves. Standing beneath the bright Texas sky with the scent of fresh hay drifting across the farm, I realized the morning had reached the moment I had expected from the very beginning. The inspection, Victoria believed she controlled, had quietly become the final piece of a much larger investigation, and for the first time since driving through my gate, she understood that she had never been the one directing the story. The investigators did not rush because they did not need to. Everything they required had already been collected long before anyone stepped onto my farm that morning. The senior investigator thanked me once more before handing the encrypted storage device to a digital evidence specialist, who immediately verified the recording timestamps against the official case log. Every security camera angle matched perfectly. Every audio recording lined up with the video. Every movement across my property had been preserved exactly as it happened, without interruption or editing. Victoria stood silently a few yards away, still clutching her clipboard, but the confidence that had carried her through the morning was gone. She looked toward the county officials as though waiting for someone to explain that this was all a misunderstanding. Instead, one investigator calmly introduced himself and informed everyone that the matter involved a broader review of public records, financial transactions, and administrative decisions connected to the homeowners association. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody made dramatic accusations. Professional investigations rarely unfold that way. They move one verified fact at a time. One board member quietly admitted that he had always assumed Victoria had permission to inspect my property because she insisted she had already confirmed everything with the county. Another admitted he had never personally reviewed the official subdivision boundary maps before participating in inspections outside the neighborhood entrance. The contractor explained that he had simply followed instructions because he believed the association had proper authorization. Listening to each conversation reminded me of something I had learned years earlier. People often make very different choices once they realize facts matter more than assumptions. The county representative unfolded a certified property survey from a protective case and placed it across the hood of his vehicle. The boundary lines were unmistakable. My farm had never been part of the homeowners association. It had never been subject to its regulations, inspections, or enforcement authority. Every document had been publicly available for years. Victoria studied the survey in complete silence before looking back toward the neighborhood maps she had carried on her clipboard all morning. They no longer seemed nearly as convincing. While that discussion continued, another investigative team quietly reviewed association financial records that had already been obtained through lawful legal process weeks earlier. As they compared dates, invoices, meeting minutes, and internal communications, a pattern became increasingly clear. Several enforcement actions appeared closely connected to private development discussions involving neighboring properties. Inspection notices had often been issued shortly before purchase offers or boundary proposals. Administrative decisions that looked ordinary when viewed individually suddenly formed a much larger picture when arranged together. I had suspected that pattern months earlier. Now the documentation was beginning to confirm it. Victoria attempted to explain that every decision had been made in the community's best interest, but the investigators simply thanked her for the information and continued reviewing the records. They were interested in documents, timelines, and verified evidence rather than emotional arguments. Standing beside my weathered fence, I watched the afternoon sunlight stretch across the pasture while my horses continued grazing as peacefully as they had all morning. Nothing about the farm had changed. The cedar trees still swayed gently in the breeze. The windmill continued its slow, steady rotation. The smell of fresh hay still drifted through the warm Texas air. Yet the atmosphere around the gravel driveway felt completely different. The authority that had seemed so overwhelming only a few hours earlier had quietly dissolved beneath simple facts, accurate records, and patient investigation. In the end, Nobody defeated Victoria with louder words. The truth simply arrived with enough documentation that it no longer needed anyone to argue on its behalf. Several months passed before the investigation reached the point where every question had been answered by documents instead of speculation. That was always my favorite part of the job. Public opinion changes every day, but records remain exactly what they are. Meeting minutes, financial statements, electronic messages, county surveys, and security recordings told the same story from different directions, and together they painted a picture that was impossible to ignore. The Homeowners Association selected an interim board while outside auditors reviewed years of administrative decisions and financial procedures. Several neighborhood policies were rewritten to match actual county regulations, and every future inspection required documented legal authority before anyone stepped onto private property. Residents who had quietly accepted questionable enforcement actions for years finally began asking careful questions of their own. Some requested reviews of previous fines. Others attended board meetings for the first time, determined to understand how decisions affecting their community were actually being made. Watching that change reminded me that accountability often spreads further than the original investigation. Once people understand that facts matter, they stop accepting confidence as proof. As for Victoria, I never saw the certainty she carried that morning again. The woman who had entered my farm convinced that authority belonged to whoever spoke the loudest eventually learned that real authority depends on responsibility, accurate records, and respect for legal boundaries. The outcome of the official process belonged to the courts and the appropriate agencies, exactly where it should belong. My role had never been to decide anyone's fate. My responsibility was simply to ensure that the truth was documented honestly and completely. After the investigators finished their work, life on the farm returned to the rhythm I had always preferred. Before sunrise, I still filled feed buckets while the morning air carried the scent of fresh hay across the pasture. The horses still waited patiently near the fence every morning, expecting breakfast with remarkable precision. The old tractor still needed occasional repairs. The windmill still turned above the barn whenever a steady breeze crossed the fields. Visitors driving along the county road would never know that the quiet property they passed had once become an important chapter in a federal investigation. That was perfectly fine with me. Farms are supposed to produce peace, not headlines. Sometimes I think back to the moment I first heard that front gate open. If I had reacted with anger, argued across the yard, or tried to prove myself at the very beginning, the story might have ended very differently. Instead, patience accomplished what confrontation never could. Every unnecessary step, every careless assumption, and every confident decision created its own record without me forcing a single moment. That is the lesson I carried away from that morning, and it has stayed with me ever since. Power built on intimidation eventually collapses under careful scrutiny, while integrity grows stronger every time it is tested. The farm still belongs to my family. The county lines remain exactly where they have always been. The same gravel driveway still welcomes honest visitors, and the same gate still opens every morning before the sun rises. The only real difference is that whenever I hear its familiar metallic click now, I smile for a moment and remember that justice never needed to announce itself. It arrived quietly, followed the facts, respected the law, and left everything exactly where it belonged.